Defending your dignity in the 19th century required an exhausting amount of paperwork and terrible fashion choices. Behind the romanticized facade of historical gentlemen settling disputes stood a rulebook so completely unhinged it reads like modern satire. We're debunking Hollywood myths to reveal the truly absurd rules that turned duels into pure comedy. 1. The Irish Code Duello of 1777 actually categorized lies to determine if you needed to shoot someone. If a gentleman gave you the lie direct, meaning he flat-out called you a liar to your face, a duel was entirely mandatory. But if he gave you the lie circumstantial, gently implying you might be playing fast and loose with the truth, you could settle it with a simple, polite apology. It was a time when passive aggression could literally save your life. Would you survive a week in a society where a sarcastic comment required a loaded pistol? 2. Intentionally missing your opponent on purpose, known as the delope, was strictly forbidden by many traditional dueling codes. You might think firing your gun into the nearest tree was a noble, peaceful gesture to end the conflict without bloodshed. Wrong. By refusing to aim at your opponent, you were implying they were not worth your powder, which was considered an incredibly arrogant, fresh insult. So, trying to be a pacifist just made the other guy want to shoot you even more. Talk about a completely toxic workplace environment. 3. If your perfectly polished, custom-made flintlock pistol decided to miraculously misfire, that was just your tough luck. According to the strict rules of engagement, a snap or a flash in the pan counted as a legitimate shot. You pulled the trigger, the universe intervened, and your turn was officially over. Now you just had to stand there, completely unarmed, desperately holding your breath while your opponent took careful aim at your chest. How calm do you think you would be, waiting for your enemy to take a free, unanswered shot? 4. Duelists always brought medical professionals along, but surgeons had a hilarious legal loophole they loved to exploit. Just as the combatants raised their weapons, the attending doctor would casually turn his back to the action. This was not due to a weak stomach. By deliberately looking away at the exact moment the trigger was pulled, the surgeon could honestly testify in court that he never actually saw the illegal act take place. They were practicing the toddler method of legal defense. If I cannot see you, a crime did not happen. 5. The seconds were the friends you brought along to ensure fair play, but sometimes they got entirely too invested in the drama. In some European regions, it was considered highly fashionable for the seconds to engage in their own side duels while the main event was happening. You invite your best friend to offer moral support, and suddenly he is aggressively crossing swords with a total stranger in the background just to be polite. It was basically the historical gentleman's equivalent of a chaotic, all-out bar brawl, just with much nicer hats. 6. Once placed at your designated mark, your feet were glued to the grass. The rules explicitly stated that dodging, ducking, or even stepping to the side to avoid a flying lead ball was an unforgivable act of cowardice. You had to stand completely upright and take it like a gentleman, relying purely on your opponent's terrible aim or a sudden gust of wind. The penalty for instinctively flinching away from a speeding bullet was permanent social ruin. Suddenly, modern public shaming does not seem quite so terrifying, does it? 7. If you thought 10 paces was too far away, the handkerchief duel was specifically for people who absolutely despised each other. Both duelists would hold opposite corners of a single handkerchief with their left hands, point their pistols directly at each other's stomachs, and wait for the signal. It was a practically guaranteed mutual destruction scenario, reserved for the most unresolvable grudges. This terrifying intimacy makes you wonder just how bad an insult had to be to warrant holding hands while trying to violently eliminate someone entirely from existence. 8. Bringing a highly accurate weapon to a duel was considered incredibly rude. The rules demanded that pistols be smoothbore, meaning they had no internal rifling to spin and stabilize the bullet. This made the guns notoriously inaccurate, practically guaranteeing that aiming was a total crapshoot. The idea was to leave the outcome up to divine providence rather than sheer marksmanship skills. If you actually hit your target, everyone just assumed God agreed with your argument. It was essentially a heavily armed, extremely dangerous version of a simple coin toss. 9. You could not suddenly decide to wear prescription glasses just to improve your terrible aim. The regulations were surprisingly strict about visual aids. If a gentleman did not wear spectacles in his normal, everyday public life, putting them on for the duel was viewed as a sneaky, dishonorable advantage. You were forced to squint into the morning fog and shoot blindly toward a blurry shape in the distance. Fashion choices dictated your survival rate, which is a surprisingly high price to pay just to avoid being called four eyes at the local tavern. 10. Direct communication on the battlefield was highly frowned upon, acting as a massive barrier to basic human decency. If you realized you made a terrible mistake and wanted to apologize right before the shooting started, you were not allowed to speak to your opponent directly. Everything had to be routed through your official seconds, like a deadly game of telephone. Imagine standing freezing in a field, waiting for your buddy to walk over and negotiate a peace treaty because strict social etiquette forbade you from simply shouting that you were incredibly sorry. 11. Proper posture was a matter of life and death. The rule books required gentlemen to stand perfectly sideways, presenting only their narrowest profile to the enemy. You had to suck in your gut, keep your arms completely tucked, and basically try to turn yourself into a two-dimensional object. Wearing dark, slimming clothes to blend into the background was highly encouraged. It was the only time in history when asking if an outfit made you look fat was a completely valid tactical military question. 12. Scheduling a duel meant ruining your sleep schedule. Custom dictated these affairs happen exactly at the break of dawn. This was not because the morning dew was romantic, but simply to evade the local police who were usually still asleep. So, not only were you risking your life, but you also had to do it before you even had your morning coffee. 13. The person receiving the challenge possessed the ultimate trump card, which was the absolute right to choose the weapons. Most picked standard pistols or swords, but the rules technically allowed anything. When a French gentleman was challenged, he notoriously chose billiard balls at a distance of a few feet. He essentially weaponized bar games, throwing a solid ivory sphere directly at his opponent's head and winning the duel without a single drop of gunpowder. The rules said nothing about sports equipment, proving that a clever loophole is a gentleman's best friend. 14. You could not just duel anybody who annoyed you. The code strictly dictated that combatants had to be of equal social standing. If a wealthy nobleman was insulted by a common laborer, challenging him to a duel was considered an embarrassing social faux pas. Instead, the gentleman was supposed to simply ignore the insult or hire someone to chase the guy away with a stick. Imagine being told you are literally not fancy enough to participate in a potentially fatal shootout. Would you feel insulted or incredibly relieved? 15. Tinkering with your gun's mechanics was heavily policed by the seconds. Some duelists secretly installed hair triggers on their pistols, meaning the gun would fire with the slightest brush of a finger, giving them a fraction of a second advantage. If a second caught you trying to sneak a modified weapon into the field, you were instantly branded a coward and a cheat. Earning a reputation as a fraud was somehow considered much worse than actually being terrible at aiming a standard weapon. 16. If a local magistrate accidentally stumbled upon your secret morning duel, the rules required an immediate, polite pause. You had to awkwardly pack up your weapons, tip your hats to the authorities, and reschedule the dispute for a later date. It was exactly like a rained-out tennis match, but with way more repressed anger. 17. The distance between combatants was usually set at 10 to 15 paces, but the rules rarely standardized the exact length of a pace. This vital measurement was entirely up to the seconds, leading to hilarious, petty arguments in the grass. A second with exceptionally long legs would try to take massive, stretching strides to put as much distance as possible between the guns, while the opposing second would argue for tiny, normal steps. Your survival odds heavily depended on whether your best friend happened to be unusually tall. 18. Retracting an insult was essentially a complex mathematical equation. The code stated that an apology must exactly match the severity of the offense. If you insulted a man's coat in public, a public apology regarding the coat was sufficient. But if you questioned his courage, You practically had to write a formal, legally binding thesis explaining how wrong you were. You could not just say "my bad" and walk away. The bureaucracy of saying sorry was so exhausting. Many men just preferred to take their chances with the pistols. 19. If you were too old, too sick, or just physically incapable of holding a weapon, the rules allowed you to legally tap out and hire a substitute champion. You could essentially outsource your personal honor to a professional. These hired guns would march onto the field and settle your petty neighborhood dispute for a heavy bag of coins. It completely defeated the purpose of defending your own dignity, but it was a booming freelance industry for guys who happened to be excellent shots. 20. In extremely rare and absurd variations, duelists would stand back-to-back and fire over their shoulders using small pocket mirrors. It was a rule designed exclusively for men who wanted to look incredibly stylish but lacked the absolute nerve to look their enemy directly in the eye. 21. In 1808, two Frenchmen actually took their bitter dispute to the skies in the first ever hot air balloon duel. Because standing in a muddy field felt entirely too pedestrian, they decided to shoot at each other's balloons with blunderbusses while floating 2,000 feet above Paris. The strict rule was that you aimed for the fabric, not the man. It was the absolute pinnacle of dramatic, over-the-top historical pettiness. 22. When legendary German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck challenged a political rival, the scientist rightfully invoked the rule of choosing the weapons. Instead of shiny swords, he selected two heavily seasoned pork sausages, loudly declaring that one was infected with a deadly parasite. Bismarck immediately canceled the duel, realizing that dying from contaminated breakfast meat was not a glorious way to enter the history books. He was completely prepared to face a loaded gun, but an aggressively spiced sausage was exactly where he finally drew the line. It proves that culinary warfare was oddly effective. 23. The cadence of the verbal signal to fire was an incredibly tense, highly regulated rhythm. The official umpire would slowly count 1, 2, 3, and you were legally obligated to fire strictly within that microscopic window of time. If a gentleman pulled the trigger a fraction of a second before the word 1, or hesitated until after 3, he was immediately classified as a common murderer rather than an honorable combatant. A completely terrible sense of musical timing could literally land you a one-way ticket to the local gallows. 24. Flipping a coin for the absolute perfect lighting was a crucial pre-game ritual. Seconds would aggressively argue for hours over the positioning of the duelists, desperately trying to ensure their man did not have the harsh morning sun directly in his eyes. It was a bizarre mix of lethal combat and professional photography logistics. Earning a strategic advantage often came down to whether your buddy could out-argue a stranger about the exact trajectory of the sunrise. 25. Clumsiness was completely unforgivable under the rigid dueling codes. If your nervous, sweaty hands accidentally dropped your heavy weapon into the damp grass before the signal, you were utterly out of luck. The rules strictly prohibited bending down to pick it back up, viewing the fumble as an act of divine intervention or sheer incompetence. You simply had to stand straight, maintain your dignity, and bravely face a heavily armed opponent with nothing but empty hands. It is the ultimate historical punishment for having butterfingers under immense social pressure. 26. Did you know owing someone money was the ultimate dueling shield? Strict codes explicitly stated you could not challenge a man if you were currently in his debt. The logic was simple. Killing your lender was considered an incredibly tacky way to avoid paying off your personal loans. So, if a wealthy gentleman absolutely hated you, all you had to do was borrow $20 from him. It was a flawless historical hack. Would you take out a massive bank loan just to gain total immunity from local gunfights? Financial leverage was stronger than steel. 27. Refusing a formal challenge did not just mean people whispered secretly behind your back. The angry challenger had the legal right to literally print large, highly insulting posters declaring you a miserable coward and staple them to trees and tavern doors all over town. This practice, known as posting a man, was the historical equivalent of an aggressive social media smear campaign, just with expensive paper and messy ink. Would you finally agree to fight if your fiercest rival bought billboard space to publicly mock your personal bravery? It was unavoidable public humiliation. 28. The strict codes of honor never really accounted for the unpredictable nature of local wildlife. If a stray dog, a confused cow, or an angry flock of geese wandered right into the middle of the dueling grounds, the entire event had to be formally paused. Gentlemen were forbidden from firing if a random farm animal was blocking the trajectory, leading to absurd moments where wealthy aristocrats had to angrily chase livestock away before they could resume trying to shoot each other. Nature was the ultimate peacekeeper. Talk about a completely bizarre farmyard intervention. 29. The absolute fastest way to transition from mortal enemies to close buddies was simply surviving the morning. If both men completely missed their shots and officially declared their honor satisfied, social etiquette strongly demanded they immediately go get breakfast together. You could fiercely try to eliminate someone from existence at dawn and completely cover their tab for bacon and eggs at 8. It was a wild emotional roller coaster. Nothing builds a sturdy, lifelong friendship quite like the shared trauma of terrible marksmanship in a damp meadow. 30. While intentionally missing was technically against the rules, some clever duelists found a highly theatrical loophole to signal their peaceful intentions. Instead of aiming at the dirt, a gentleman might dramatically raise his pistol high toward the sky and pull the trigger, sacrificing his valuable shot to the clouds. It was a grand, incredibly risky gamble. You were publicly throwing away your only defense and praying your angry opponent possessed enough basic morality to not shoot an unarmed man. It usually resulted in immense mutual respect or a very sudden funeral. 31. Instead of standing still, some gentlemen used the terrifying barrier method. 2 wooden sticks lay on the ground 10 feet apart. Duelists started far back, slowly walking forward, allowed to fire at any time. But here is the massive catch. If you panicked, fired early, and missed, you were legally forced to walk to your barrier and stand perfectly still while your opponent casually strolled up for a point-blank shot. It was essentially the most stressful game of chicken ever invented. 32. Your wardrobe choice could actually spark a massive cheating scandal. Wealthy 19th century men discovered that wearing multiple layers of thick, densely woven silk shirts acted as rudimentary body armor, occasionally catching low-velocity bullets. If seconds suspected you were wearing unauthorized tactical fabrics, they demanded an impromptu fashion inspection. Getting caught secretly bulletproofing yourself with luxury underwear was a remarkably quick way to ruin your social standing forever. 33. Dueling was absolutely not just a ridiculous hobby for men. High society women frequently engaged in petticoat duels to settle their own fierce disputes. In one famously absurd 1892 incident, a princess and a countess fought a fierce sword duel simply because they could not agree on the floral arrangements for a musical exhibition. They even hired female medical staff to ensure strict propriety. Can you imagine being so passionately angry about decorative roses that you challenge a rival to a lethal sword fight? 34. When future American President Abraham Lincoln was challenged, he cleverly used the defender's right to choose weapons to guarantee his own safety. Knowing his opponent was an expert marksman, Lincoln selected massive cavalry broadswords. Having incredibly long arms, Lincoln simply stood at a safe distance and casually swung the heavy blade to violently chop off a high tree branch. Realizing he could never get close enough without being sliced in half, the challenger immediately surrendered. Spatial awareness is a gentleman's best friend. 35. If the seconds experienced a logistics nightmare and only brought a single working pistol, the event was not cancelled. Instead, they relied on the sheer terror of drawing straws. The man who pulled the longest straw was handed the loaded weapon, while the loser was legally obligated to stand at his mark completely unarmed and bravely accept his grim fate. Stripping away all illusions of skill, it left everything to random luck. Would you bet your entire future on a dried piece of grass? 36. The threshold for a lethal insult was shockingly low. Historical records show gentlemen demanding satisfaction on the field of honor, entirely because someone corrected their Latin grammar during a fancy dinner party. There was no argument over stolen money, just pure, unadulterated linguistic rage. Imagine willingly standing in a freezing meadow and risking a heavy lead bullet simply because you used the wrong verb tense and could not handle a little constructive criticism. 37. For those who found standing in a sunny field entirely too boring, the pitch-black room duel offered a terrifying alternative. Two gentlemen were locked inside a completely dark, unlit room with loaded pistols. They navigated in absolute silence, desperately listening for a breath or a creaking floorboard to locate their target. Transforming a standard dispute into a highly dangerous game of Marco Polo, it proved some men would rather stumble in the dark than simply apologize. 38. The entire concept of concluding a duel rested on the highly subjective rule of satisfaction. The violent affair only ended when the offended party verbally declared his honor was restored. If both men completely missed their first shots, but the challenger was still feeling grumpy, they had to reload and repeat the process. You were entirely at the mercy of your enemy's personal mood swings. A stubborn opponent could legally force you to keep shooting until they were sufficiently entertained. 39. Proper etiquette demanded that you handle all transportation logistics before the shooting started. You were strictly required to pay your carriage driver for a full round trip entirely in advance. It was considered the height of terrible manners to perish on the dueling ground and leave your surviving friends to awkwardly cover your cab fare back home. Even while facing your own demise, you were fully expected to be a responsible commuter and a generous tipper. 40. Unpredictable weather was the ultimate buzzkill for angry aristocrats. Because historical pistols relied on loose black powder loaded into an open flashpan, a sudden rainstorm completely ruined the weapons. You could be staring down your absolute worst enemy, but the very second a light drizzle started, the seconds blew the whistle. Everyone awkwardly packed up their wet bags, shook hands, and trudged home through the mud. Mother Nature simply refused to respect their strict schedules of violence. 41. Sword duels often utilize the famously hilarious first blood rule, where the entire life-or-death dispute ended the very second someone got a tiny scratch. Two grown men would fiercely swing heavy steel blades at each other until one received a microscopic nick on the forearm. The attending surgeon would dramatically declare a severe injury, honor was instantly restored, and both men could happily go get breakfast together. It was essentially an incredibly dangerous, overly dramatic version of playing tag with extremely sharp kitchen utensils. They fought like angry lions just to need a tiny bandage. 42. Medical professionals had their own terrifying spin on the traditional dispute. Instead of using messy firearms, two feuding doctors might agree to a completely silent poison pill duel. One pill was harmless, and the other contained a fatal dose of toxic chemicals. The challenger picked first, swallowed his capsule, and the other doctor immediately took the remaining one. It turned a gentlemanly disagreement into an incredibly stressful game of pharmaceutical roulette. Would you ever trust a furious medical rival to compound those pills fairly? 43. Maintaining a stern, dignified facial expression was a strictly enforced regulation. If you happened to have a nervous tic, or if you simply smiled out of pure anxiety, your opponent could legally claim you were arrogantly mocking them. This fresh insult technically allowed them to demand an entirely separate duel, just to address the inappropriate smirk. You had to suppress every natural human emotion and maintain a perfectly blank poker face while facing a loaded gun. A nervous giggle could literally cost you a second bullet to the chest. 44. Punctuality was an absolute cornerstone of historical honor. If you were even 15 minutes late to your own scheduled duel, you automatically forfeited by default. Your opponent's seconds would dramatically declare you a miserable coward, pack up their things, and proudly head out for breakfast. A broken carriage wheel or a slightly slow horse could completely destroy your social reputation forever. Have you ever lost your entire social standing just because you hit a little bit of unexpected morning traffic on the way to a gunfight? 45. To cleverly evade local law enforcement, desperate duelists sometimes chose to stand waist-deep in a freezing river. By physically removing themselves from solid ground, they aggressively argued that the local police had no legal authority, claiming the dispute fell entirely under maritime jurisdiction. They were literally willing to freeze in muddy, fast-moving water, just to exploit a geographical legal loophole. Honor apparently meant absolutely nothing if you were not also eagerly practicing a little bit of amateur maritime law on the side. 46. Selling tickets to your lethal dispute was highly illegal, completely ruining the entertainment value for the local townspeople. Duelists had to fiercely guard their secret locations because if a crowd of random spectators gathered, the strict rules demanded an immediate cancellation. Honor was considered a private affair, not a chaotic theatrical performance for bored farmers. Imagine setting up the perfect dramatic showdown, only to angrily call the whole thing off because some nosy neighbors brought snacks and wanted to watch the violent show. 47. Directly apologizing was considered a massive blow to the ego, so the strict rules invented the brilliant phantom apology. Your second would whisper an extremely quiet apology to the opposing second, who would then formally accept it on his client's behalf. The two actual combatants would stand perfectly still, staring blankly ahead, legally pretending they heard absolutely nothing. It was a complex, highly choreographed theatrical performance designed entirely to preserve the fragile egos of two men who were far too stubborn to simply say they were sorry. 48. The seconds had incredible administrative power, including the absolute right to veto the duel at the very last microsecond. If the attending friends suddenly decided the original insult was actually a simple misunderstanding, they could confidently step between the loaded guns and formally cancel the event. The duelists were legally bound to respect this sudden decision, even if they were still furiously angry. It is genuinely amazing how quickly a deadly, passionate dispute dissolves when the official referees simply refuse to let you play. 49. If you successfully survived a highly publicized duel, custom dictated that you politely send a brief, formal notice to the local newspapers. You absolutely did not brag about winning, but rather calmly stated that a meeting of honor had occurred and both gentlemen behaved completely appropriately. It was essentially the strict historical equivalent of vaguely changing your relationship status online. You desperately wanted the entire city to know you were incredibly brave, without sounding like you were fishing for cheap public compliments. Alright, we have explored 49 of the most absurd regulations, and there is only one final rule left on our list. But before we reveal number 50, it is time for the final verdict. The award for the absolute dumbest rule easily goes to the mandatory phantom apology. Just think about it. Hiring a buddy to whisper a quiet apology to another guy's buddy, while you both stare blankly ahead, pretending you heard absolutely nothing, all to protect your fragile egos. It is peak absurdity. Do you agree with this verdict? Let us know in the comments. And now, our final entry. 50. The three-strike divine intervention rule was the ultimate safety net for genuinely terrible marksmen. If both gentlemen completely missed their targets for 3 consecutive rounds, the rules strictly forbade reloading a 4th time. The official seconds would declare that divine providence had clearly spoken, demanding the 2 men remain alive. After burning through all that expensive gunpowder, the combatants were legally required to shake hands and instantly become friends. It was a mandatory, legally binding happy ending for people with exceptionally bad aim. We laugh at these men risking their lives over minor insults, but human nature rarely changes. If deadly duels were completely legal in America today, what kind of slight do you think would lead to the most duels? Drop your wildest theories in the comments. Prove your modern honor by smashing that like button and subscribe so you never miss our next historical deep dive.